Hello, this is the Metaphysics Review. The sections for metaphysics include consciousness, freedom and determinism, and the self. We're going to run over these so that you will have a good idea of what you need to know for the quiz. The consciousness section had three different theories: dualism, physicalism, and functionalism. Let's run over these now. René Descartes was the first really famous dualist, although Plato was also a dualist. Descartes argues that the mind is separate from the body. They're two different substances. The mental substance is a non-physical, non-local substance. What that means, well, nobody really has figured out what that would or could mean if it was true. Descartes argued that the properties of the mind are different from the body, so therefore they must be two different things. He could not offer an explanation of how the mind and body interact. So dualism is sometimes referred to as interactionism. A separate type of dualism is known as property dualism. This basically does away with the idea of the mind and focuses on mental events like ideas or feelings or instincts. These are also labeled non-physical. They're just not unified in something that we would call the mind. Now let's consider the criticisms of dualism. Churchland made the following two criticisms. He said something with no mass cannot interact with something solid that has mass, like a body. So if you're defining the mental as something that's non-physical, then you're forced to demote it, he used the term demote, to something known as epiphenomenal. This word, epiphenomenal, means that the mind is viewed as a sort of an offshoot of the body. So you've got the brain carrying out different activities. It's using reasoning to come to decisions, and then the experience, the feeling, the subjectivity that we think of as ourselves, well, that is just an offshoot. It's meaningless. It's nothing. It plays no role because it cannot interact with the physical body. The typical phrase that epiphenomenalists use is emergence. The mind emerges from the activities of the brain. It emerges and then just kind of hangs there in some way. Another criticism of dualism was made by Gilbert Ryle. This was a famous criticism in which he argues that there was a category mistake. If you compare two different things, like oak leaves and maple leaves, and then maybe compare a leaf spring from an old car, you would be making a category mistake if you considered the leaf spring to be another type of leaf. That's what Descartes did, Ryle says. No, it's all physical. Ryle wants us to try to think of the mind as physical. If you read his book on the subject, you will read an amazing attempt by him to describe everything that we think, all our ideas, everything, in terms of behavior. Of course, this completely ignores the experience that we're trying to explain. So Ryle makes a mistake there himself when he tries to turn everything into behaviors. We're not trying to explain the behaviors, we're trying to explain the experience of the behaviors. If dualism presents too many problems for us to use it as a theory, then what other options do we have? Well, one option would be physicalism. The mind is the brain. Physicalism says that the only things that exist are the physical, so that would mean that the mind would have to be something physical. We could possibly make an argument that the mind is some sort of electrical energy or something like that within the brain, but it would have to be something physical that we could point to. So one theory would be identity theory. Identity theory is a physicalist theory that says that the mind is identical with the brain. It doesn't necessarily say what the mind is, only that it is identical with the brain. That leaves some wiggle room. Eliminativism, on the other hand, is a physicalist theory that says that it's just the brain and we should go so far as to eliminate mental talk. Love is a certain number of neurons firing at a certain frequency, and that's all we should say. No more talk of love, no more talk of literature or anything like that. Physicalism presents some problems too. And the most obvious problem is this tendency that physicalists have to downplay or eliminate entirely mental life. So a professor named Nagel used a technique called phenomenology to analyze the mind. Phenomenology tries to focus on a very particular experience and to eliminate all interpretation of it in an attempt to get at it in a pure form. Nagel uses this technique to try to get to the experience of a bat. What is it like to be a bat? Now, you might ask, why? Wait a minute, hold on. Why do we want to know what it's like to be a bat? Well, the answer is that if there's something unique about a bat's experience of the world, then that means that there's something unique about the human experience of the world, and there's something unique about dogs and cats' experience of the world, and we shouldn't be writing it off, because we can reduce the human body, the cat body, the bat body, down to their brains, their neurons. We could pull them apart. But if that doesn't get us to what it is to experience the world like a bat, a cat, a dog, or a human, then we've missed something. We've lost something. So Nagel's argument here is that we cannot ever, as humans, understand exactly what bats experience. All the objective facts that we learn just don't give us the full experience of flying around using sonar to create a picture of the world around you so that you can hunt for food. It's beyond us as humans to imagine doing that. Now, you might get pretty close, and Nagel talks about that, but there's something special about being a bat, and therefore there's something about mental life that needs to be explained. Doesn't mean physicalism is wrong, but it's not complete. It's not a full theory. The author named Jackson named these elements of mental life qualia. Qualia, Qualia. And Professor Montero went on to make a very basic criticism of physicalism. She said, we have incomplete theories of the physical world. We sometimes learn, we sometimes have these massive breakthroughs like quantum physics where we suddenly change our entire view of what makes up the world. So at one time we thought there were just atoms. Atoms were the smallest bits of matter. And then all of a sudden we found out that there's subatomic particles. This major breakthrough suggests that we don't know everything there is to know about the physical world, and to try to reduce the mind away to the brain without knowing how the physical and the mental, or how the mental comes about from the physical, it's going too far too fast. Physicalism is a premature theory. The final and third theory is functionalism. Functionalism simply defines the mind in terms of its functions. What is consciousness? Well, it's speech, perception, mathematical ability, and a few other abilities put together, wrapped up nice and pretty like a present for someone with a bow on top. Artificial intelligence can therefore be conscious because it can mimic the functions of the mind. Functionalism really comes out of computer programming. The breakthroughs in computer programming made a lot of computer programmers feel that consciousness was within the grasp of computer programming, even though it wasn't in the grasp of any other science in the past. It was computers that were going to do the breakthrough and give us the secret to human consciousness. We're reaching the limits now of where we can go with that. And John Searle out in Berkeley in 1980 gave us one of the most powerful arguments against the idea that artificial intelligence can be conscious. His argument was known as the Chinese room argument. If a person was locked in a room and had a big dictionary with the various Chinese pictograms in it, and next to those pictograms were other pictograms that should be made in response to them. If Chinese speakers gave him questions in Chinese, he could match up the symbols and come up with an answer that was a real answer in Chinese. But he wouldn't understand Chinese. The understanding goes beyond that. Now, it's hard to put into words what that extra thing is that gives you understanding of a language, but linguists use the term semantics. It's the meaning of the words, the meaning of the sentences and grammar, and that you can compare to syntax. Syntax is rules. If you follow rules and produce an answer, 3 + 3 = 6, then you have not achieved semantics. You are following rules. Following rules is probably necessary for semantics, but on its own, it does not give you semantics. We heard about that kind of argument. Remember the distinction in logic between necessary and sufficient causes? We can say syntax may be necessary for semantics, but is not sufficient to create semantics. And that's Searle's argument. We are now moving on to free will and determinism. Each of the authors in this section offers up ideas about what's necessary for us to have free will. Now, if you watched my first video, my introduction video on this section, you saw my description of how everything is caused by something in the world. Right? There's a physical cause for everything. For that not to be the case means that the laws of physics don't apply. And this seems to include human beings. Psychology, sociology, and the other sciences also agree that we are programmed in many ways. We are pushed towards different choices in our lives by things that happened in the past. Your parents teach you to think a certain way. Your teachers teach you to think a certain way. Are you free or are you programmed? This is a question that we're going to look at. Some of the suggestions have been simply the ability to choose your own motives, the ability to act according to your psychological causes, not external causes, like somebody putting a gun to your head. the ability to act without concern for whether something is agreeable or pleasurable to us. We're going to look at these separately. De Holbach argued that everything we do to obtain pleasure. And because we cannot escape this drive to only choose things that bring us pleasure, we aren't free. This is kind of a logical argument, you know. Of course we try to achieve pleasure. We don't want to suffer pain. Well, that doesn't seem like a huge insight into human nature. But his argument is worth looking at. What would it take under his, if you take his argument seriously, what would it take for you to be free? You would have to be able to choose to suffer pain. And it would have to be a choice where you didn't think suffering pain would gain you something pleasurable in the future. So an athlete who's willing to suffer pain to become a better athlete is doing it because they believe that they'll get more pleasure out of suffering that pain than if they didn't. So de Holbach wants us to make choices that are beyond that. De Holbach wants us to be able to, I guess, to be able to choose to suffer for no reason at all. That seems to be his argument. That obviously doesn't make a huge amount of sense when you think about it. Do you need to be free to choose against your best interest to be free? A professor named Stace argued that if we are presented with real choices, such as, having eggs or pancakes for breakfast, without the coercion of outside forces, then your choice is free. To put it in another way, what you need to be making a free choice is your psychological motives led you to choose. And that's it. Whoever you are, however you choose, it has to be based on your free ideas, your freely made up mind. Now, hard determinists, of course, will disagree. They'll say, look, all those ideas that are in your head were caused by external forces. But Stace says, yeah, but they're ours. So as long as we're following our own choices, it's free. Now, we can go a little bit beyond Stace and say, well, look, maybe we're forced by causes from the past to do a lot of things. Maybe we're always going to choose to be healthy because our parents just put it in our heads we have to, and we can't choose to be bad. We can't choose to take a drug for pleasure, or to just lay around eating ice cream all night. You can't do it. It's not in you. Okay, but you could choose different ways of being healthy. You could choose different gyms to go to. You could choose a different sport. Maybe we are programmed by our past experiences, but when presented with equally satisfactory choices, maybe we do have a free hand to make decisions. That would be a counter argument to the hard determinists. Next, we have William James. James said that free choice does not represent a problem for scientists. The reason why is the world works according to physical laws, and scientists seem to be concerned that if you had a free choice, it would represent a breakage or a stopping of the natural laws that run the world. So if you could suddenly lift off of the ground, that would be, that would mean that gravity stopped applying to you. That never happens, right? Well, what about all the other physical laws that represent how atoms work colliding into each other, how molecules work? Um, Surely everything is being produced through the interactions of those atoms and molecules. But James says that still does not represent a problem to the physical laws of the universe. And he says, he gives a hypothetical. He says, look, if you consider two ways that you might walk home from school, right? There's two different ways you could go. You choose one or you choose the other. Now, in two alternate universes where each one of those choices was made. So in one universe you went one way, in another universe you went another. A scientist looking at those two choices would not be able to show where the universe suddenly stopped working according to natural laws. There wouldn't be any stoppage of scientific laws. There wouldn't be a break in the universe's functioning. Free will does not represent a problem for science. That was James's argument. And then he went on to make another argument that we have this sense of ethics and morality, and that gets thrown out the window if we don't have free will, because you can't blame someone for doing something they had no choice in. Next, we turn to Nagel, who argues that the question of free choice doesn't really make as much sense as it seems to. We're worried about whether causes in the world force us to make the choices that we do. And he says, but our having a personality really means making certain kinds of choices over and over. If you had free choice such that you never did the same thing, or you were never forced to do the same thing over and over again, that would mean you have no personality. You don't have a self. Now we're going to see that some people say that there's, no self. That's in our next section. But we'll, notwithstanding those arguments, it seems like you would be losing all the laws of psychology, and you would be losing your personality. More importantly, you wouldn't be you if you randomly did things. One day you eat and one day you don't eat. One day, you go to the gym, and the next day you do something completely different. Does that make any sense? To be a person means you're making choices because you are who you are. And finally, we have Professor Taylor, who says that human choices come about from complex causes. They're not simple ones like you're hungry so you ate food and you had no other choice because you were hungry. There's so many things that go into a human choice, that's a complex one, a weighty one. So if you think about choosing what you're going to do, what career you're going to go into. Of course, your parents, give you advice, and the school gives you advice, and you're going to look for something that makes you money, right? Because you want to be able to eat, you want to have a nice house. Well, those seem like simple enough causes pushing you. But there's really a lot more to it than that if you think about it. I mean, if you really hated the idea of going into healthcare, or if you really hated the idea of sitting at a desk all day long, you might find other ways of making a living. Um, Depending on how much you've thought about it, you might have questions about, healthy lifestyle. You might have a question about how much money you really need to make. Maybe you need to make millions, or maybe you'll be happy with a $30,000 or $40,000 a year job, and that would make you happier. There's a lot more going into your decision than what what philosophers have often pointed to. So Taylor says it's not that easy to even know what goes into making a choice free or not. And now we're starting the section on the self. The first definition of a self that we looked at was John Locke's. Locke told us that the human self is nothing more than psychological continuity. We have memories of actual events that occurred, and we are conscious of them, and that psychological continuity is the self over time. David Hume basically said, hey, John Locke, where is this self that supposedly is there with all our memories? I don't know where it is. I don't know where it is at all. I can't find it. There is none. There is something that sees and hears and does things. That's my body. But there doesn't seem to be anything we can call a self, other than our bodies and the ability to perceive. Together, there is this sense of continuity. That's all. That's all there is. Next, we studied Schechtman. Schechtman argued that the self is a coherent autobiographical narrative. What she meant by this is that psychologists have studied human memory and tried to see how it works and what it does for us. And what they found out is that our memories are not of what happened. They are more a personal experience of our lives. Now, there's all different types of memories. She looked at studies that showed, for example, that our memories are condensed. We have oftentimes one memory that represents maybe 12 or 15 different events in our lives. We may have memory of a particularly noteworthy event, one that does not represent all of them, but it comes to represent everything. So if you played Little League when you were younger, maybe in the one game where you hit a home run, it stands out in your memory. You remember doing that. You remember that home run. And your experience of it might be that was, everything. That was what it all built up to. That was the purpose of Little League for you, was getting that home run that day. You might not remember any of the other games. There might have been, you might have hit triples and doubles, and you might have struck out 50 times, and you sort of remember it vaguely. But what you remember is hitting the home run with the feeling that this was it. This was what it was all about. It's how we make sense of our lives. It's how we make sense of the memories that we have. And the memories themselves do that for us in a way. So it's kind of built into the functioning of our brains. Finally, we have Professor Giles and his description of Buddhism's take on the self. Basically, the self is a group of related images that allow us to construct a self-image of something that isn't really there. Buddhism tells us that the self is an aggregation, a combination, or a grouping of things. There's a body, there's perceptions, there's feelings, there's motives, and there's consciousness. But these things seem to add up to a self, but it isn't really real. It's not really there. So when you meditate in Buddhism, you get past these things, you escape these things, and you ultimately find that there's no self. There's a concept of the no self in Buddhism. Okay, so these are the things, the basic ideas that you need to know for the quiz and for the final as well. It will help you very much in the final. I hope that this was helpful for you. Good luck.